All right, so we're going to dive into something that might sound a little dry at first. The Federal Election Commission,
Mm,
or the SEC for short. And it's this agency. It keeps an eye on how all that money flows, in U.S. elections,
yeah.
specifically the federal ones. And we're going real deep on this chapter. It's from a 2025 Presidential Transition Project book. Basically, it's like advice for whoever the next president is
Hmm.
on how to handle this agency
Mm.
because it's pretty powerful. And get this, it actually says that sometimes too much regulation can actually be bad for free speech.
Yeah, that's right. And this chapter, it really highlights how unique the FEC is set up.
Yeah.
It's designed to have this like built-in tension, six commissioners, right, split right down the middle between the two big parties, all appointed by the president. And what makes this like really interesting right now is that a bunch of the commissioners, their terms are ending, which means the next president, they've got a big chance to really shake things up at the FEC.
It's like it's like a big political chess game or something. And the next president gets to make some like really important moves. Oh, and speaking of interesting, you know, players in this game, the chapter mentions this commissioner, Ellen Weintraub. And get this, her term was up like way back in 2007, but she's still there.
Yeah. It's kind of a quirk of the system. Commissioners can just stay on until the Senate confirms a replacement. And
Yeah.
this actually shows a really key point that the chapter makes. The whole appointment process, it can lead to these unexpected situations
Mhm.
and even like complete gridlock. It's not always, smooth or efficient.
Gotcha. And there's another interesting thing the chapter goes into. It's this tradition of like picking FEC nominees from both parties. So basically presidents would, you know, talk to the other party about who to appoint. But in 2020 and 2022, that didn't happen. And the nominees were confirmed just along party lines. So
Yeah.
what do you think the consequences of, that change might be?
Well, I think it could be a sign that the FEC is becoming more partisan, which could definitely affect how well it works. And the author seems worried that it could lead to the agency focusing more on, political fights instead of making sure elections are fair for everyone.
So instead of working together to keep things, fair and square,
Hmm.
the FEC could turn into just another battleground in our political divide.
Yeah, that's the worry.
Mm.
And to make things even more interesting, the chapter goes on to talk about the relationship between the FEC and the Department of Justice, or DOJ. And it's not exactly a simple relationship.
Yeah, the chapter makes it clear there's some kind of power struggle there.
Yeah.
What's the dynamic like between those two?
Okay, so the DOJ, they have the power to actually bring criminal charges for, breaking campaign finance laws. And it's like,
Wow.
the big stick.
Mhm.
Meanwhile, the FEC, they handle things on the civil side, like fines, settlements, that kind of stuff.
So you could get hit with like actual criminal charges, even if the FEC doesn't say you did anything wrong.
Technically, yeah. And that's why the chapter really emphasizes that. The DOJ should be really careful and only go after people for, blatant intentional wrongdoing. They shouldn't try to interpret ambiguous laws against people. The author really wants them to, take a cautious approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want people getting punished for like honest mistakes or,
Yeah.
just different interpretations of the law. But here's where it gets really interesting. The FEC can actually defend itself in court. They're not like totally at the mercy of the DOJ.
That's right. They've got their own legal team. But the chapter tells this crazy story about some Democrat commissioners who just refused to defend the FEC in some lawsuits. It's like they were trying to get around that rule. The one where they need 4 votes for any enforcement action.
Wait, so they were like intentionally throwing the case? That seems pretty strategic.
Yeah, the author definitely sees it as a problem. They say it's an abuse of power. And it weakens the FEC's ability to, actually enforce the law. It really shows how partisan politics can mess with what should be a neutral process.
So we've got this whole like tangled web, appointments, potential gridlock, a power struggle with the DOJ, and the commissioners maybe playing politics. It's a lot. What does the chapter actually suggest we do about all this?
Well, the author has some pretty strong opinions on how to reform things. The most urgent thing, they think, is to stop commissioners from staying on after their terms are up. Sounds simple, but it could really change how the FEC works. And
Yeah.
they also say the president needs to be really careful who they pick for those commissioner spots, especially with all those terms ending. The stakes are high. Yeah, for sure. The author really sees those expiring terms as like a golden opportunity for the next president to, appoint commissioners who really care about fair elections and free speech.
And speaking of big reforms, the chapter also mentions this for the People Act of 2021. What's the author's take on that?
Well, it's interesting. They're not a fan, actually. The act wanted to make some pretty big changes to the FEC, like shrinking it down to just 5 commissioners. And the author thinks that's a dangerous idea. He says it would make it easier for one party to control the whole thing.
So they actually like prefer the current setup with 6 commissioners,
Yeah.
even with, the possibility of gridlock. They think that's better than one party having too much power over elections.
Exactly. They think that rule, the one where you need 4 votes to do anything, forces everyone to compromise. And that helps to keep things balanced. They think gridlock is actually better than one party calling all the shots.
Huh. That's a really interesting argument, that gridlock can sometimes be good for democracy. But the chapter doesn't stop there. The author has some other ideas for reform too, right?
Oh, yeah. They say that the way things are now, all those campaign finance rules, they're actually hurting grassroots political activity. They think the whole system is, too complicated and burdensome, especially for smaller campaigns and just, everyday people who want to get involved.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement, that the FEC is making it harder for people to participate in democracy. What's the logic there?
Okay, so they point to stuff like contribution limits, which haven't kept up with inflation. Think about it. The amount you could donate, decades ago, that doesn't buy nearly as much today, right? And this hurts smaller campaigns more because they rely more on those small donations.
So instead of making things fair, those limits are actually giving an advantage to, wealthy donors and special interests.
That's what they're saying. And it's not just about the money either. The author also talks about all that paperwork and reporting. It's a lot. And it can be a real nightmare for volunteers and small campaigns. They don't have, big legal teams and accountants to handle all that stuff.
Right. So you've got regular people who want to get involved. But they're facing this mountain of paperwork and rules. That could be pretty intimidating. I can see how that would make people think twice about participating.
Yeah, and the author links that directly to free speech. They say that if people are, afraid to speak out or donate because they might accidentally break some obscure rule, that's a problem. It's like chilling their First Amendment rights.
Yeah, it's like the system is rigged against the average person.
Yeah.
But what's the solution then? How do we, protect elections without making people afraid to participate?
That's the million-dollar question, and the chapter does offer some concrete suggestions.
Okay, so what does the author think we should do to fix this?
Well, one big thing they say is raise those contribution limits. Make them, more realistic so small donors can have a bigger impact.
Okay, but wouldn't that just lead to even more money in politics?
It's a fair point. That's why the author also wants stricter disclosure rules. They say if we're going to allow bigger donations, we need to know exactly where that money's coming from and how it's being spent.
So more transparency to balance out the potential for, too much influence from big money.
Exactly. Give people the information they need to, hold their elected officials accountable.
I like that. Empowering citizens through transparency. What else do they suggest?
Oh, they also talk about indexing those reporting requirements to inflation.
Yeah.
So basically, the threshold for, when you have to report something, that would adjust automatically over time. It wouldn't change the rules themselves, just make them less of a burden.
So instead of having to constantly update the rules, they would just, adapt to the changing economy.
Yeah.
That seems like it would streamline things a lot.
That's the idea. Make it easier for people to participate.
Okay, so we've got raising contribution limits, more transparency, and indexing reporting requirements. Anything else in their reform toolbox?
Well, they also address that big issue we talked about, the For the People Act. And remember, they don't want to change the structure of the FEC, but they actually support a lot of the other reforms in that act.
So they agree with some of the goals, just not the way they want to achieve them.
Right. For example, the author likes the part about strengthening disclosure rules for online political ads. They know those digital platforms are becoming really influential in elections, and they think transparency is key to, making sure everyone's playing by the same rules.
That's interesting. Finding common ground on specific solutions, even when you disagree on the big picture. It sounds like the author's really trying to strike a balance here.
Yeah, they want to protect elections, but also make sure the system isn't, stifling free speech and participation.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
They believe real campaign finance reform should empower people, not just limit the influence of money. They want everyone to feel like they can participate and have their voices heard.
Yeah, it really seems like this chapter wants us to rethink how we do campaign finance. It's not just about keeping money out of politics. It's about making sure everyday people can actually participate.
Yeah, exactly. The author wants a system where, people feel encouraged to get involved, whether it's, donating to a candidate
Yeah.
or volunteering for a campaign or even just like speaking their mind about the issues.
That makes
Right?
sense. But that kind of brings up another question. If the next president, agrees with all this, what can they actually do to make it happen? Especially if, Congress isn't on board with these reforms.
Well, even without Congress, the president can do a lot more than you might think. Remember, they get to choose who's on the FEC.
Oh, right. They
They,
can appoint people who,
right.
share their vision for campaign finance.
Exactly. And they can also, like, use their platform to talk about these reforms, trying to get the public on board. Plus, there's the DOJ. The president can tell them to focus on, like, real cases of corruption, not just technicalities that scare away regular people.
So even without new laws, the president can change the whole tone of the conversation. Show that they actually care about free speech and people getting involved.
Definitely. It's about making politics seem like, a good thing, not something scarier and, like, something to avoid.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. I didn't realize how complicated campaign finance is. It's not just about, keeping money out. It's about finding that balance between transparency, fairness, and protecting free speech.
For sure. It's a tough balancing act. No easy answers. But I think this chapter gives us a good way to, like, think about how to build a system that actually works for everyone, not just the, rich and powerful.
I agree. So what do you think about all this?
Mhm.
Is there a way to make a system that, encourages people to participate, but also make sure elections are fair? It's a question worth thinking about. And maybe, if we all, really think about these issues, we can find a way to make our democracy even better.